The text alert came through on a quiet Sunday morning. My brother wanted me to co-sign a $38,000 loan so he could drive off the lot with a new car. The words glowed on my phone with his usual arrogance, like he assumed I would roll over without hesitation. I typed 2 words back, short and sharp. Keep dreaming. That should have been the end of it, but only minutes later another notification appeared. This time it was my father, his voice arriving like a verdict. Refuse, and you are cut off. Cut off from dinners where I carried trays while the rest of them toasted with wine that cost more than my entire week of groceries. Cut off from birthdays where my brother's gifts stacked high in ribbons and boxes, each worth hundreds, while mine were thin envelopes stuffed with guilt money. Cut off from holidays where I cooked turkey and side dishes for 15 people, the receipts adding up to $350, while my seat at the table was shoved into the corner like a servant waiting for scraps. They called it family. I called it servitude. In that moment, the weight of years pressed down, but underneath it burned something sharper. They had always believed loyalty meant blind obedience, that silence meant consent, that threats would bend me into their mold. What they never realized was that silence can also mean preparation, and when the day comes, what happens when the daughter they thought had nothing is the one holding all the leverage? For years I carried the weight of a family that only saw me as a resource. When my brother came to me with his grand idea of launching a startup, he said it was just a small favor, only $15,000 to get the business going. I signed the loan in my name, he promised to pay it back, and I spent the next 3 years covering payments with interest, while he walked away with nothing but excuses. Later came the medical bills, another $8,000, and I was told I should pay because I was the responsible one. Then there was the $5,000 favor that was supposed to be temporary, but the money never found its way back. Every time I questioned it, the answer was always the same. Family means sacrifice. It wasn't just money. It was time and dignity. On Thanksgiving, I spent days preparing meals that cost between $300 and $400, hauling groceries, cooking for hours, and setting tables while they opened bottles of wine priced at $100 each. They would laugh in the living room while I scrubbed pans in the kitchen. At Christmas, my brother unwrapped a brand new laptop worth $1,200, while I got a thin scarf still carrying a discount tag. No one even looked twice. It was as if my role was written for me, and my value measured in what I could provide for them. The chair at the end of the table became my symbol. It was never just a seat. It was the corner where I sat, close enough to serve, but far enough to remind me I was separate. They called me dependable, but what they meant was useful. They praised my strength, but only when it kept them comfortable. Over the years, the resentment grew, pressing down on me with each check I wrote and each holiday meal I cooked. I stayed quiet, but every slight, every unpaid debt, every dismissive smile left its mark. The silence they mistook for obedience was in fact my record, my tally of years spent being used. And when the time came, that silence would be louder than any words I could ever speak. I had learned that silence was my strongest weapon. While my father barked orders and my brother demanded favors, I quietly collected every piece of evidence that showed the truth of what they owed me. Bank statements marked with payments I had covered, tax records that listed my name while they reaped the benefits, and property deeds that revealed how often I had shouldered responsibilities that were never mine. Each document became a brick in a wall I was building, not around me, but between me and their control. Month after month, I added to the stack. I totaled the figures late at night when no one could see. $15,000 for the failed startup, $8,000 in hospital fees, $5,000 in cash that had vanished, and the countless smaller amounts that piled into something undeniable. By the time I finished, the total reached more than $68,000. That number was no longer just a sum of money. It was proof. It was a ledger of years they had taken from me under the disguise of loyalty. At family dinners, I smiled faintly and kept my head down. I passed the wine, served the food, and let them believe I was still their dependable daughter and sister. But in my apartment, I organized files and clipped receipts, preparing for the moment I would finally use them. The turning point came the day I dialed Attorney Collins, a financial lawyer whose voice carried the kind of calm certainty I needed. When she answered, I knew my silence was over. The preparation had ended. The action was about to begin. The call with Attorney Collins felt like stepping into another world. Her voice was calm and measured, the kind that carried quiet confidence instead of noise. She explained the process in simple terms. The paperwork would invoke Clause 7, a motion to freeze joint accounts that my father believed were his safety net. Within hours, the $42,000 emergency fund was no longer his weapon. It was locked under legal authority, requiring my signature for any access. What once chained me to their demands had become the key to my release. I signed the papers with a steady hand. For years, my signature had been the trap, the mark that bound me to their debts. This time the pen felt like a sword. Collins assured me that once the court processed the filing, I would no longer be liable for any debts tied to those accounts. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before, but for me it was the first taste of real control. I left her office lighter than I had felt in years. The panic came quickly. My brother's texts arrived in a flood, one after another. He begged for a $2,000 deposit, saying the dealership was holding the car and that he had already promised he would show up. His words bounced between anger and desperation, each message shorter and more frantic than the last. Then came my father's voicemail. His voice was sharp and booming. He warned me that family loyalty meant sacrifice. He told me that if I would not bend, then I was no daughter of his. I listened to it twice, then saved it. Evidence, not a threat. The shift was clear. For years, their voices had been commands that echoed like law. Now those same voices cracked under the weight of fear. The emergency fund had been their cushion, the place they turned when recklessness caught up with them. By freezing it, I had turned their comfort into their cage. Their threats no longer held me. They were trapped in their own desperation, clawing at doors that only I could open. For the first time, I felt the balance tilt. Power had finally changed hands, and this time it was mine to keep. My father burst into my office like he owned the ground beneath my feet. His face was red, his hands slammed against my desk, and his voice thundered accusations about family honor and shame. He told me I had embarrassed them, that people would whisper if they learned I had turned against my brother. He tried to bury me under guilt, the same way he always had. I stayed seated, calm, hands folded on the desk like a judge listening to a plea. Without raising my voice, I reached for my phone and pressed play. His own message filled the room, words he had shouted into my voicemail now echoing back at him in sharp detail. Family loyalty means sacrifice. If you will not help your brother, you are no daughter of mine. The sound bounced off the walls, his own tone exposing him better than I ever could. I watched his face shift, the color draining as he realized what those words meant outside his control. Investors who praised his integrity, relatives who looked up to him, and even his own mother would hear abuse instead of authority. My brother stood behind him, wringing his hands, desperation written across his face. He whispered about the dealership, about the car, about how he would owe me forever if I just helped him now. I turned to him slowly and told him he already owed me forever. He flinched like the truth had weight. For once, his promises meant nothing. The room felt less like my office and more like a courtroom. Evidence sat on my phone, dignity in my posture, and judgment in the silence I let linger. My father shifted, fists clenching, but his words carried no power anymore. The louder he had once barked, the weaker he sounded now that his threats stood as proof against him. I leaned forward, steady, and reminded him that respect was not optional. At that moment, the trial was over. I had won, not by shouting, but by showing him the truth he could not escape. The day I drove to the dealership felt like a line drawn in stone. I walked past rows of shiny vehicles and stopped at the one that caught the light just right. A midnight blue sedan priced at $31,500, gleaming as if it had been waiting for me all along. The funds released from the frozen accounts made the purchase possible, but the decision was more than financial. Signing those papers was my declaration that my life was no longer theirs to control. When I slid behind the wheel, the leather was cool against my palms, and the air carried the faint scent of new beginnings. I started the engine, and the quiet hum felt like a heartbeat in sync with my own. This was not just transportation, it was dignity in motion, freedom wrapped in steel and glass. Every mile ahead promised something my family could never give me: choice. As I guided the car onto the open road, the city stretched before me, lights flickering like a horizon of possibility. The chains they once wrapped around me had fallen away, and in their place was an open highway with no limits. I was not running from them anymore, I was driving toward myself. Loyalty without respect is nothing more than exploitation. For years I had mistaken sacrifice for love and silence for duty, but I finally saw the truth. A real family is not the people who demand everything and return nothing. Real family is the circle you choose, the people who honor your boundaries and treat your dignity as non-negotiable. The night I drove through the city in my midnight blue sedan, the streets glowed with neon and glass, and I felt lighter than I ever had at any holiday table. Revenge had never been the prize. The true victory was peace. Knowing I had finally chosen myself without apology, I was no longer carrying debts that were never mine, or sitting at the end of a table where respect never reached. The lesson was simple, yet hard-won. Saying no does not mean weakness. It means drawing a line and standing firm in who you are. When you stop letting others define your worth, you discover a strength you never thought you had. The silence that once kept me trapped had become the silence of freedom. And in that quiet, I finally heard my own voice.